Good afternoon. My name is Yolanda Bundy. I am the Environmental Sustainability Director for the city. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We will go through phase 2 of our coastal vulnerability project. In today's presentation, we will provide you with a summary. We will also discuss the next steps. But before we start, I want to thank ESA to being present. Solisha Antico, our city environmental analyst. And let's start the presentation. Next slide, please. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and we will have the opportunity to discuss and ask questions at the end of the presentation. This afternoon's agenda, we provide you about the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Report. We will also share with you the public survey results. And then we will talk about the current codes, regulations related to the sea level rise, and discuss what other jurisdictions have done about this issue. Next, we will have the opportunity to hear from you, our community, and get your input on the next steps. And finally, we will present the report and your comments to our city council. Next slide, please. Now, please let me introduce James Jackson. He is our consultant's coastal engineer. He is a state licensed engineer. And ESA was selected because they are an excellent firm with experts that will help us conclude our coastal vulnerability assessment. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Environmental Science Associate Company, they began incorporating sea level rise considerations into this project back in late 1980s. So they have plenty of information related to this topic and also a significant number of experience. With that, please welcome James Jackson from Environmental Science Associates to provide us with a summary of the Malibu Coastal Vulnerability Assessment.
Thank you, Yolanda. Next slide, please. So I'll give a quick summary of our Coastal Vulnerability Assessment technical findings that were first presented during the Phase 1 workshop. The recording of the virtual workshop can be watched on the Malibu website, which we'll have a link to later on in the presentation. As summarized on this slide, the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment evaluates several types of coastal hazards for existing conditions and future sea level rise. These include regular tidal inundation from monthly high tides, long-term shoreline, dune, and bluff erosion, as well as temporary storm flooding and wave run-up impacts. Hazard mapping for these categories are provided by the USGS Cosmos Hazard Mapping Program. Malibu experiences coastal hazards as indicated by the photo examples shown here. The left image shows shoreline erosion in front of the lifeguard facilities at Surfrider Beach. The middle image shows king tide inundation of coastal properties in Malibu, and the right image shows storm wave run-up and coastal flooding impacts such as the 1982-83 El Nino. Next slide, please. The Coastal Vulnerability Assessment analyzed 3 sea level scenarios: existing sea level or existing conditions, and 2 future sea level rise amounts of 2.5 feet and 6.6 feet. The projected date ranges shown here represent planning timelines that should be used depending on a project's risk tolerance following the 2018 state guidance on sea level rise. The earlier dates are recommended for evaluating critical infrastructure such as emergency facilities, water and wastewater infrastructure, and major transportation infrastructure, while the later dates are recommended for community-wide planning studies such as this Coastal Vulnerability Assessment for Malibu. Next slide, please. Since the draft vulnerability assessment was completed, the state of California has released a draft guidance update for sea level rise. This was released in January 2024. The OPC is committed to updating this statewide guidance approximately every 5 years to keep pace with advancements in the scientific understanding of sea level rise. This latest update was made following the latest International Climate Change Assessment Report, as well as recent updated sea level rise science and projections by the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration in 2022. Next slide, please. Based on the draft updated sea level rise guidance, the sea level rise scenarios that we evaluated for our study have shifted further into the future. The blue column shows the updated timing. 2.5 feet is now projected between 2070 and 2075, while 6.6 feet is projected between 2100 and 2130. Again, the earlier dates in this range should be considered for critical infrastructure planning, while the later dates could be considered for community-wide sea level rise planning, such as this study. This updated information will be incorporated into the final Malibu Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Report. As indicated with this update, sea level rise science is ever evolving, and the scientific community understands and models the changes in sea level rise science. I would like to note here that these projections of future sea level rise are precautionary by design. Similar to designing a building for earthquakes, it is important for communities to plan ahead conservatively by evaluating these possible sea level rise projections to understand the potential worst impacts and actions that may be needed to ensure the safety and livelihood of the community, environment, and the city as a whole. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the sea level rise vulnerabilities in Malibu identified through the technical assessment. In terms of projected impacts, we're going to discuss its city's development, the Pacific Coast Highway, and beaches. Development, including residences and commercial buildings, is exposed to shoreline and bluff erosion, as well as storm surge, wave runup, and overtopping along the coastline. Additionally, low-lying areas may be subjected to coastal storm flooding and tidal inundation. On-site septic systems may also be at risk of coastal erosion, tidal or storm impacts, as well as rising groundwater levels. Pacific Coast Highway is vulnerable to erosion and coastal storm flooding and wave runup in a number of locations through the city. Beaches in Malibu are primarily narrow under existing conditions. For example, 5% of the coastline has little to no beach above the high tides. If sea level rises by 2.5 feet, over 40% of the coast could be without a beach, and nearly 80% of the coast could be without a dry sandy beach with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Next slide, please. During the Phase 1 workshops, we presented sea level rise exposure maps for 8 city subareas showing the potential effects of 2.5 and 6.6 feet of sea level rise in each location. The maps, recording of the first workshop, draft vulnerability assessment report, and interactive web map can all be accessed at the link shown here on Malibu's website or by scanning the QR code. Now, Celicia will discuss the results of the public survey following the last round of workshops.
Thank you, James. Next slide, please. All right, my name is Celicia Antico, and I'm the Environmental Sustainability Analyst here for the City of Malibu. Now we're going to give a summary of the findings from our public survey. The public survey opened first on November 1st of 2023, 2 weeks before our first workshops, and it closed on November 30th, 2 weeks after the workshops. We had 76 people anonymously respond to our survey. Next slide, please. So just to provide some background information about people that had taken our survey, of these 76 respondents, 51 people, or 67% of the respondents, stated that they live along the Malibu coast. 7 people live along the Malibu hills, and 18 people reside outside of Malibu. Next slide, please. We then asked how the survey takers use the coastal areas in Malibu. Over 2/3 of respondents live in Malibu. More than 1/3 of respondents visit the coastal areas, and under 1/3 of people work in the Malibu area, like myself. Next slide, please. In this survey, We had asked, what is people's favorite place or activity along Malibu's coastline? Of the 72 respondents, 57 people mentioned that their favorite place was along the beach or the ocean. Some of the answers we received for people's favorite activity along the Malibu coastline included surfing, walking the beach, swimming in the ocean, watching waves, and more. A few of the favorite specific beaches that were mentioned numerous times in the survey answers included Westward Beach, Latigo, Broad Beach, Nicholas, Escondido, Zuma, Point Dume Beach, Paradise Cove, and Surfrider beaches. Next slide, please. After receiving information from the community about how they use the coastline, we asked questions more focused towards sea level rise. Nearly 99% of respondents stated that they had heard about sea level rise. When asked if people think sea level rise and coastal erosion are issues in Malibu, 76% of people stated yes, it is an issue. 14% of people said somewhat, and nearly 8% of people said no. One person did state that they were unsure. Next slide, please. We then asked if the community thinks the effects of sea level rise in Malibu should be addressed. A majority of people, about 77% of respondents, stated that the effects of sea level rise should be addressed. 6 people answered that the effects should somewhat be addressed, and 6 people stated that sea level rise should not be addressed, and 5 people had answered unsure. Next slide, please. We also asked what changes people have noticed in Malibu due to coastal erosion or storm flooding and received 67 write-in responses. The number one response from over half of the survey respondents was the loss of beaches and sand. Second, respondents have noticed an increase in erosion along the coast and higher tides and wave run-up. For reference, due to the last El Nino winter and high king tides, our Environmental Sustainability Department was working with 10 different properties that experienced coastal erosion due to this high wave run-up, and we're assisting with submittals for erosion control measures. A handful of survey respondents also answered that they saw no changes that were caused by erosion or storm flooding over time. Next slide, please. We also asked what the biggest concern related to sea level rise in Malibu is, and answers were provided in a short answer format. The top answer from 59% of respondents was that the biggest concern was loss of property, beaches, coastal access ways, and roadways, specifically Pacific Coast Highway. The second biggest concern at 11% is how the city and the California Coastal Commission are going to allow permitting of mitigation measures in order to protect our beachfront properties. Respondents have requested that the city and California Coastal Commission work together and be supportive in allowing property owners to do improvements to protect their property. We would like to mention that the California Coastal Commission has reviewed our draft coastal vulnerability assessment report and provided feedback and minor comments, which will be addressed in our final report. The third biggest concern at 10% is erosion of the beach sand and bluffs and lack of sand for beach replenishment. And finally, 6% of respondents stated that they had no concerns related to sea level rise in Malibu. Next slide, please. We had asked what coastal assets do survey respondents or participants feel are important to include in the study. The top 4 rated assets to include are beaches at 93%, roads at 78%, and a tie of housing and protected environmental areas at 71%. Also included in this list were buildings with cultural significance and parks, natural landmarks, fire stations, and businesses. Next slide, please. Lastly, we asked if the community had seen any examples of sea level rise planning in other cities that they've had found successful or promising. 41% of the respondents answered that they did not see or know of any examples. People that had seen successful or promising examples of sea level rise planning discussed California agencies such as Ventura, San Clemente, Santa Barbara County, Santa Cruz, City of LA, Venice, San Diego, and Marin County. Several other places were mentioned, including New York City, Venice, Italy, and the Netherlands. The adaptation measures that survey respondents described had included artificial reefs, submerged rock breakwaters, groins, dredging, dam removal, revetment, and beach and dune and lagoon restoration. We were also provided with some documents related to sea level rise, which staff have reviewed. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to pass the presentation to Yolanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Salisha. The remainder of the presentation caters to the results that we receive on this public survey and also communication with our community. We also have included the comments that we have received from our California Coastal Commission and also numerous stakeholders. Their feedback was integrated and developed in the remainder of the presentation. Overall, as Sulisha has mentioned, the majority of the survey responders have stated that they have seen some changes along our Malibu coastline due to sea level rise, coastal erosion, seawater flooding, and other coastal hazards. And they're interested in understanding what can we do as a community to mitigate the effects of sea level rise. Let's now discuss our existing regulations, our codes, and guidance relative to adapting and or mitigating the effects of sea level rise as requested by you, our community. Next slide. Malibu follows local codes and regulations, including the Local Coastal Program, Land Use Plan, and Local Implementation Plan, better known as LIP. These codes ensure consistency with the Coastal Act and are intended to minimize the impacts from coastal hazards. Chapter 4 of our LUP outlines requirements regarding shoreline development. Some of the goals of the LUP policies includes the following. First, developing a strategy to address the issue of sea level rise, both in the short term via permitting action or the long-term responses to address future development impacts along the shoreline. This coastal vulnerability assessment addresses the long-term responses. The second is requiring a wave uprush and impact report for development projects that are developed on the beach, on beachfront and bluff-type property. This is actively being required for all applications that we receive on development projects. Now, I would like to pass the presentation to ESA's coastal engineer, James Jackson, to discuss what is the state and regional regulations level.
Thank you, Yolanda. So next slide, please. There are several states' Senate bills that address the issues of sea level rise and climate change. SB 272 covers sea level rise planning and adaptation. It mandates that the California Coastal Commission establish guidelines for the preparation of a sea level rise plan on or before December 31st, 2024. So by the end of this year, the California Coastal Commission needs to develop and establish guidelines. This Senate bill also requires local governments in the coastal zone to develop a sea level rise adaptation plan by January 1st, 2034, about the next 10 years, as a part of the local coastal program, subject to approval by the Coastal Commission. Local governments that receive approval for a sea level rise plan would then be prioritized for funding for implementation of sea level rise adaptation strategies and recommended projects if their plan is in place by January 2029. SB 337 responds to the 30 by 30 lands and waters conservation goals, such that at least 30% of California's lands and coastal waters are conserved by 2030. SB 379 requires California cities to incorporate climate adaptation and resiliency into their general plan safety elements. Next slide, please. The California Coastal Commission has published several guidance documents to help jurisdictions plan for sea level rise. In 2018, they released a sea level rise policy guidance, which includes general policy guidance for incorporating sea level rise into LCPs or local coastal programs, coastal development permits, and regional strategies. It highlights the planning steps involved and guidelines for sea level rise adaptation. Next slide. Next is the California Coastal Commission Residential Adaptation Policy Guidance. This is a companion document to the other report and focuses specifically on residential issues. Not shown here, the Coastal Commission has also published guidance specific to critical infrastructure such as water and wastewater, power plants, transportation, and other major infrastructure. Next slide. Additional guidance on sea level rise adaptation is provided by the 2018 Ocean Protection Council report, which is in its draft update form as of January 2024. As discussed previously, the draft Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Report initiated in 2019 utilized these 2018 reports. We will update our draft assessment to include the new projected timing of sea level rise scenarios that I discussed earlier. Next slide, please. Over the next few slides, I will discuss various next steps that other jurisdictions have taken to address sea level rise adaptation plan. Next slide. One more. Thank you, Robin. The first step that jurisdictions commonly take after assessing coastal vulnerabilities is to identify potential adaptation measures or individual tools that can be used to mitigate hazard risks. Adaptation measures can be described along a spectrum that ranges from green, natural or nature-based measures to gray, or more structural man-made measures, as well as hybrid options in between. Green techniques include sliving shorelines that have been implemented at Zuma and Point Dune beaches in the form of dunes that help to buffer storm impacts to the parking and roads behind the beach, as well as maintain the beach width for recreational and ecological functions. Some gray techniques are currently being used in parts of Malibu, which include rock revetments, seawalls to protect the coastline, as well as raising homes above tides and flood levels. Next, please. Many jurisdictions then take the next step beyond identifying a range of potential measures and go forth to analyze potential holistic solutions that address sea level rise for the community and public infrastructure. This entails conducting a case study to evaluate one or more series of adaptation measures that could be implemented, for example, through the end of the century. And these case studies are known as adaptation pathways or adaptation alternatives. And the study evaluates a number of considerations, including economic costs and benefits for different adaptation alternatives, as well as other trade-offs. The example graphic shown here is taken from the city of Pacifica, and it shows the costs going down from the axis and benefits going up from the axis, in this case, recreational value, but these could also include tax revenue from residential or commercial properties and other considerations. The three alternatives depicted here were developed for the city, for the Pacifica State Beach, which is largely a public area with limited development. And alternative one includes protect with armoring. Alternative two includes protect with nourishing the beach. And alternative three included realigning parking and infrastructure. Next slide, please. Jurisdictions then typically develop an adaptation plan. So it's building on the last two options, first identifying the list of measures, and then providing a case study to evaluate some potential solutions over time. An adaptation plan includes these first two issues, as well as identifies monitoring and implementation framework that could include triggers and thresholds of when to do adaptation actions over time. It also prioritizes near-term actions, including the next steps towards hazard monitoring and adaptation implementation. A number of adaptation plans have been completed in the state of California, including several by ISA, such as those at Manhattan Beach, Santa Barbara, and Pacifica. Next slide, please. When developing adaptation plans, it is important to consider other local efforts. For Malibu, I'd like to summarize 2 ongoing adaptation efforts that affect resources within the city. The Los Angeles County Beaches and Harbors published their coastal resilience study at the end of 2023. They evaluated the impacts of sea level rise on their beaches throughout LA County and prioritized beaches that could benefit from an individual adaptation plan. LA County is considering several adaptation measures for county beaches in Malibu at Zuma and Point Dume Beach. These include beach nourishment, living shorelines such as dunes, and other measures to increase the resilience of beaches and public amenities. Next slide, please. Caltrans is also prioritizing sea level rise and climate change adaptation efforts for its many roadways in the state, per the Caltrans Adaptation Priorities Report from 2021. Caltrans District 7 covers Los Angeles County and includes several bridges, culverts, and roadway segments in Malibu that are designated a high priority for individual adaptation assessments. Next steps for Caltrans include initiating these individual adaptation assessments, starting with the highest priority assets, and importantly, these will include engagement and coordination with key stakeholder groups such as the City of Malibu. Next slide, please. So to summarize potential next steps for sea level rise adaptation planning, here are 3 typical next steps that other jurisdictions have taken to address adaptation in their community. 1 is to keep it high level, identify applicable adaptation measures, and prioritize near-term options for further study. 2 could be to analyze potential solutions, doing a specific case study that evaluates a holistic approach to adaptation in the community and includes a cost-benefit analysis. And 3, one could develop a plan. The sea level rise adaptation plan for the entire community would include monitoring, triggers for implementation, and other information to guide the community's adaptation into the future. Thank you very much. I would now like to pass it back to Salisha.
Thank you, James. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move on to the interactive portion of the workshop. This is the most important aspect to us because this is where we are looking to receive your input, our community's input. We are going to move forward and have 2 discussion questions that we would like your input on. Please either answer by typing in the chat or raising your hand to be called on to discuss. These questions are also included in our public survey, which was just released today, if you'd prefer that method to be able to provide your input. The link will be provided at the end of the presentation in order to access that survey. Okay, next slide, please. Our first question asks, what next steps do you think the City of Malibu should take to increase the community's coastal resilience or adapt to sea level rise? This question is crucial. We are developing this public survey and are seeking your answers, and will present the survey results to our City Council for their further direction. When we had asked this question during our in-person workshop that was held on April 18th, and we had developed a list of valuable ideas that our community members had discussed. Just a few of these ideas included, for example, compiling relevant adaptation measures for Malibu and prioritizing our near-term options. Another example was evaluating adaptation of the sensitive habitats or environments, considering environmental justice as part of our coastal adaptation, exploring different changes, or developing an in-depth adaptation plan. So with that being said, I would like to now open up the discussion to ask you, our community, what next steps do you think the City of Malibu should take to increase the community's coastal resilience or adapt to sea level rise? Again, feel free to type your answers in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to discuss at this time. Hello, Councilmember Paul.
Hi, I think we have a.
Oh, we're losing your audio there.
Sorry, I think we have a great opportunity. Now, I'm guessing you can't hear me.
Sorry.
Okay,
We can hear you now, Paul. Try
Okay.
again.
All right. I think we have a great opportunity in front of us, typified by the probably blocking. Have thousands of truckloads of fill that has never been exposed to the air supplies times. So the likelihood of any kind of shin from it is placement as part of a, or to allow the coast's currents to turn it into sand, which it will do. We obviously can't put it in an area that's currently a valuable habitat and bury eelgrass and things like that, but there are places where it can be done. They've identified a point offshore Panga Lagoon. There have to be other. The object is place it there, have it by the sea, mushed in sand. That's my idea for the day.
Thanks, Paul. I think you're cutting in and out, but I think I got the gist of it, and you highlighted a couple of good ideas. Let me try and reiterate for everyone here. One is to utilize opportunistic sources of sand or compatible sediment that could be placed to help nourish the beaches and improve coastal resilience. These programs are often referred to as SCOOPs, Sand Compatibility Opportunistic Use Program. So if there's a development project that's doing grading and they need to export material, and this material matches sediment characteristics and quality that enable it to be placed in the coastal zone, that's a good opportunity to use that material that might otherwise go to a landfill or somewhere else if it can help improve beaches. And I think the second part of your idea was to build on some other ideas that are going on, including Topanga and near shore placement of sand, not directly on the beach, but I think you were talking about the near shore placement of sand for the ocean to slowly dissipate and move that sand inland to help nourish beaches. Am I right?
You are correct, but I would like to emphasize the fact that the near shore placement of landslide debris.
Landslide. Gotcha.
It doesn't have to start out as perfect sand. Ocean's actions probably create the sand.
Thank you, Paul. Don, I see you've got your hand up.
I do, thank you. I have a couple comments. I'm also, hopefully with a little better audio, because I've discussed with Councilman Grisanti this topic. I'm going to clarify because his audio is so broken up. I mentioned this in our first public workshop, and I acknowledge the fact that when you did your study, you were operating in 2019, you were operating off the old 2018 OPC, but we're still reporting to the community 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And both the federal government and the OPC study, which just came out earlier this year, which is probably the best scientific study that I've seen on this topic, is predicting 8 inches of sea level rise by mid-century and 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And the probabilities become less predictable as we go out in time. And so this is really, really important that we clarify this to the community, because the community is going to be doing land use planning and coming up with policies and regulations. And also there's a lot of folks that own shoreline homes and businesses that are deeply alarmed by these numbers, which are just not scientifically correct. The other thing that I would strongly recommend is in your toolbox that you showed for options in regards to protecting the shoreline, both the developed shoreline and the natural shoreline, is that of artificial reefs. This is something which is being moved forward on aggressively by a number of other communities, which are currently doing designs and implementing that into their local coastal program updates. I'd also point out it was not for sediment management, but there was a report that just came out on the artificial reefs that were put out there off of Palos Verdes, which has been phenomenally successful in regards to enhancing the kelp forests and the marine habitat. So reefs not only protect our beaches and protect our community, but the environment loves them as well. And then the last point to build on what Councilman Grisanti was stating, James, I understand what you said in regards to compatibility studies and sand grain, et cetera, and that's not exactly it. That's classic beach nourishment to put it right on the sand. Sandy beaches. But the 1986 Malibu Land Use Plan, Santa Monica Mountains Malibu Land Use Plan, envisioned depositional points where fill dirt and landslide debris could be placed into the intertidal zone, basically replicating what Mother Nature does when there's big storms and the streams and the rivers carry unconsolidated material down into the intertidal zone. There it is naturally sorted, and then it is carried by the longshore current, the sand grains nourishing the beach. This has been something the Beacon, which is one of the most respected beach environment and beach nourishment organizations in the state of California, just to the north of us in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, has been espousing for a long period of time. So I don't think that Councilman Grisanti, James, was speaking specifically towards properly sized sand grains being utilized for beach nourishment, but rather identifying deposition points where clean filled dirt from whether it be from grading projects or from landslide debris cleanup could be placed so Mother Nature could sort it. So I appreciate your time and all the excellent hard work.
Thank you, Don. Those are all great points, and thanks for helping to clarify Paul's comments.
James, just to talk a little bit more about what the first point that Don had mentioned was in our 2018, when we first started in 2019, we were using the 2018 Ocean Protection Council. One of the points that Don is making is that the latest science doesn't reflect that of the current 2018 Ocean Protection Council. Can you discuss how we have updated our study in order to address this question?
Yeah, so we're including a few slides into our presentation. I've listed the updated timing that matches the scenarios that we evaluated for the vulnerability assessment. A key point that the new updated guidance makes is that for existing vulnerability assessments, you don't necessarily need to redo your vulnerability assessment as long as you're still looking at a reasonable range of sea level rise based on the new timing. And so we'll update our report to include the new timing of those projections. And I'll reiterate, these are the upper end of the span of sea level rise projections. And we, as engineers and planners, select precautionary sea level rise scenarios when we're going through this vulnerability assessment phase. So we want to identify, the potential worst impacts and identify all the potential issues that may arise and the potential measures that may be needed over time. But when the city goes forward, or other jurisdiction has gone forward to start developing adaptation plans, actions will be triggered and sequenced in time by way of monitoring sea level rise as it occurs, or monitoring the progression of hazards, the erosion of a beach, the reduction of a bluff top offset as bluffs erode, or other observable measures of progressing hazards as a way to actuate adaptation in time. So I hope that kind of addresses how we're reflecting the new updated guidance at the timing of sea level rise projections we evaluated, and how an adaptation plan would importantly acknowledge the full range of sea level rise projections based on the latest science, not just looking at these high-end projections, which we've done so for the vulnerability assessment.
Okay, Reg Brown.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't find the little hand symbol on my computer here, so I want to thank you guys for doing this. I think it's a pretty good deal, although I caution everyone for using one sea level rise scenario. The scenario that's being shown here has a 0.5% probability of even occurring. And that's the Coastal Commission State of California numbers in their 2018 report. The current sea level rise in the Santa Monica Bay, which Malibu is part of, the sea level rise rate is 6 inches per century. That's the current sea level rise rate. That rate has basically remained the same for 60 years. If you go back into NOAA's sea level rise measurements back in 1960, the average sea level rise for the 50 years, with 1960 being in the center, was 6 inches per century. So sea level rise has not really changed in 60 years. I would like to see Malibu look at other sea level rise scenarios with a higher probability of occurrence. The one here, the 6.6 feet, has a 99.5% probability of not being met. That's almost 100% in my book. Something more appropriate for single family residences would be the expected sea level rise, or what they call the median. If you look at a probability curve, a bell-shaped probability curve, the median is right smack in the middle, and that's the expected outcome. Based on the State of California report and the Coastal Commission report, again, that's the 2018 report, the expected sea level rise for the year 2100, end of the century, is a little under 2.3 feet. Having people design for 6, 7, even 9 foot sea level rise seems to place an undue burden on people that live on the beach. I would like to see people start, when they talk about sea level rise, I would like to see people start talking about 4 items when they talk about sea level rise. The first is, where's the sea level rise occurring? California has a variety of this. They have 15 locations that NOAA measures sea level, and they're all different. And Crescent City is actually rising faster than the sea, so you're getting a drop in sea level there. So the first is where. The second is by what year. The third is how much. And the fourth, which is very important, is the probability of that being met or exceeded. And I keep seeing people throw around 6.6, 6.8, 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And we're nowhere near that on the projection. If we were to stay on that in projection, NOAA has said that sea level rise needs to be 8 millimeters a year for it right now, or actually in 2020, for that scenario to even come up and be met. Right now, sea level rise as measured by the NOAA gauge station in Santa Monica is 1.55 millimeters, which is significantly lower than the 8. So we're tracking well below a lot of these scenarios. And I would just like to see all 4 points made when we're talking about sea level rise, in particular, the probability of that scenario coming to fruition.
Yeah, thank you for that information, Reg. Oh, am I echoing? Okay, we're good. Yeah, I think you're bringing up some very good points, and this is something that we had discussed internally as well. We understand one of the comments brought up by Don in our first workshops, and you as well here, along with some others, is the unlikeliness of the 6 feet scenario. And we, since the study has come out and we presented with the results, we are in agreement with that as well. The H++ scenario has been ruled out as being unlikely, but I think by this point, one of the beauties of our study is that we have identified 2 different sea level rises to evaluate: a 2.5 feet of sea level rise and a 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Whether you tie the times into that or not, we can understand at 2.5 feet of sea level rise, whether that's in 50 years, 100 years, that's going to keep changing based on the science, the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted, so on and so forth. We can at least have an understanding of what critical assets along Malibu's coast will be impacted in that time. So yes, love that comment. And I do appreciate you talking about adding the probability of that being met or exceeded. Maybe James can speak some more about that, but we were looking at the updated 2022 NOAA guidelines and the draft 2024 State of California guidance as well when we were coming up with the probabilities of the 2.5 feet and 6.6 feet. So James, would you like to discuss a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I want to point out and reiterate what Don and Reg have brought up is to include in moving forward in Malibu with adaptation to sea level rise, including more information to characterize, various amounts of sea level rise and where they fit into the range of what we're calling sea level rise projections, likely range of projections versus potential high end range. And again, the vulnerability assessment by definition is to identify the potential worst outcomes. So we look at that high range of sea level rise, and we can, like Salisha mentioned, contextualize those amounts, 2.5 feet and 6.6 feet in the greater span of potential sea level rise. On the point of probability of occurrence, us humans don't know the probability of sea level rise. And we've been, as practitioners, trying to discuss that more and kind of clarify that the probabilities in these guidance documents are likelihoods of occurrence based on the ensemble of global climate models that are used to model the various processes that affect sea level rise. And so it's important to recognize that this is a likelihood based on model predictions and results, and we don't know that the actual probability of sea level rise occurring at any given time, but we have a good understanding of the likely amount of sea level rise and potential worst outcomes with sea level rise. So acknowledging all of this information moving into adaptation is really important so that the city and its residents and other community members can think about the assets that they are concerned about, whether it's a infrastructure element, a road, a home, the beaches themselves, park amenities like a picnic area along the shore. All of these, what we call coastal assets, can be thought of having different risk tolerances. And so it's important to understand, the likelihood of sea level rise and compare that to what we're talking about. We're planning for the whole city or planning for an individual asset.
Thank you. Don, do you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Salisha. I left something out with apologies. In regards to a comment, I think that you ought to take a hard look at, seeing as this is a vulnerability study for Malibu, and we're talking about what the different options are, is that significant sections of the coastline in Malibu are completely developed. And both in the Coastal Act under Section 30253 and the recent case law with the Casimir Homeowners Association, the city of Malibu is going to be obliged to allow shoreline protection devices. Now, this is not just an academic exercise that you're going through with all this study and analysis. It's to craft policies. And one of the things I like about what you did here is, again, you had the toolbox for the different steps and different options predicated upon how much sea level rise that we actually get, including everything from shoreline protection devices to dune habitat to breakwaters and things of that nature. This is not, this is something that's going to be a substantive tool for the city and the property owners to use in their future planning efforts. The Reg, for instance, is one of the most respected coastal engineers within this community, and he's always working on individual applicants to do their coastal wave uprush report so that their house can be designed accordingly or their remodel. And I think that what would be very effective would be for the city to identify the sections of the coastline where, as a municipality, they're going to be legally obligated to allow shoreline protection devices, because I think that's going to be a guiding aspect in regards to what the city might pursue as more holistic, environmentally based options to protect sections of the coastline, as opposed to armoring everything, which is where we're going to find ourselves if we don't get proactive on some of those critical sections of the coastline. So I appreciate you letting me get that extra comment in, Celicia. I'm not going to dominate the airwaves. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Don. And that's the exact kind of feedback that we're looking for. We're seeking your guys' input, the community's input, to help us understand the next steps that you would like to take. So thank you so much for providing that. Reg, I see your hand up to you.
Okay, yes, and thank you, Don, for talking and bringing those items up. I think what is very important for beaches in general, and particularly in Malibu, is that we have an adequate sand supply. And the sand comes from the Santa Monica Mountains. We still have a lot of sand out. The profiles indicate that there's a lot of sand, you know, forming sandbars and everything like that out there in the ocean. But after we get a lot of rain flooding the local rivers, we get a lot of sand on the beaches. And in 1969, we had fires in Malibu, and then we had the floods in the winter of 1969, and there were pretty big floods. And Broad Beach had widened 150 feet by 1970. And so it's a very important that we as a community, and maybe the city council should take a look at this as to if we can force Caltrans, the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, that are in charge of taking these debris that would normally go out into the ocean and carting them off to a landfill is not doing Malibu any good. The best thing that you could have to protect the shoreline is more sand. So that's all I wanted to bring up. It's kind of in line with what Don was saying as well.
Thank you for that, Reg. We are in some of our stakeholders that we're talking to are Caltrans. They were at our in-person workshop and also working very closely with beaches and harbors. So in our future stakeholder meetings, this is definitely a suggestion that I'll be bringing up to them. Awesome. And I know there are a couple comments going on in the chat as well. Karina Johnson had mentioned that they would like consideration of nature-based adaptation solutions. Some of these options could include dune restoration, coastal wetlands, and other habitat restoration. Kathleen Summers is also interested in a very extensive plan for mitigation to be able to provide access to not only the residents, but also visitors to Malibu. And Karina also pointed out something that's been coming up in my mind as we're having these conversations as well is the project of removing the Rinch Dam, which could possibly bring a lot of sediment down into the lagoon area too. Awesome. Well, with that being said, I think if we can move on to the next slide and we'll go on to question number 2. So for question number 2, we ask, how can the city work with local communities, scientists, and stakeholders to develop comprehensive plans for adapting to sea level rise. What role should each of these groups play in the decision-making process? And answering this question is going to help us understand the procedures to take once we have your guidance on the next steps and all of your answers to the first question. So when we asked this question during our in-person workshop, I want to list just a few of the items that were brought up during that discussion. One of the items included a request to work closely with property and homeowners in order to increase information sharing, gain local knowledge, and foster collaboration. It was also discussed to host workshops with our community to help communicate the process and gather input to inform the city's approach to adaptation planning. A third is engaging with other agencies that are experiencing this issue, such as Caltrans and LA County Beaches and Harbors. So Reg Brown, you're right on point. And another option is educating homeowners and renters on coastal hazards and shoreline change. So these are just 4 answers that were discussed out of a whole list of options that were provided. So now with that being said, I'd like to open up the discussion to you, our community, and ask, how can the city work with local communities, scientists, and stakeholders to develop a comprehensive strategy for adapting to sea level rise? Again, feel free to put your point in the comments or in the chat, or raise your hand if you would like to provide some input.
I'd like to bring through one of Karina's points from the prior question, which is speaks to this question too more, and that's to please consider meaningful tribal input and engagement.
Yeah, some of the other points that were brought up during our in-person workshop also included having a beach pop-up. So having a little stand so that we can talk to people that are using our beaches in order to educate and gather some more feedback from them. Councilmember Paul. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Don's hand was up already.
Oh, okay. Let's go ahead, Don. Don, would you like to provide your input?
Yes, don't be so local. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of other communities that have made some good forward progress in regards to how to address sea level rise. And there is some strength in numbers, as I mentioned before, for some of these alternatives. I would highly recommend that the city of Malibu reach out to some of these other communities. Happy to assist on that, by the way, and send you some contact information, see what they're doing. A lot of them are using the lower levels of sea level rise, but they are also proactively, as I mentioned before, looking at some different alternatives to protect the beaches and their communities. And then the other one for the local stakeholders is the homeowners associations, and what a number of the communities are doing to put the muscle of the municipality behind this is to work with the homeowners association to come up with, as opposed to on a house by house basis, something which is more enlightened to protect a whole stretch of beach, again, like an artificial reef, coupled with beach nourishment and sand dunes. Now, we have a bitter experience with the one effort on that in Malibu, which is the Broad Beach, which I'm not going to get into all the details on that. But the failure of that to date should not dissuade the city. And in fact, I just want to affirm that a number of these other communities are planning on doing just that, working with the homeowners associations to form GHADs, geologic hazard abatement districts, to promote artificial reefs and coupled with beach nourishment to address sea level rise and shoreline erosion.
Awesome. Thank you, Don, for providing that input. Some of the HOAs are a few of the stakeholders that we reached out to as part of this study as well. So we do wish to continue that partnership as this study continues on. Councilmember Gersani.
Let's try again. I think the most effective thing we could do is to the Coastal Commission that it is okay to let landslide debris reach the ocean. Just what would have happened? Coast was populated. Several years ago, I think in 2017, there was a large landslide in Ventura County, just over the line up there, and it blocked the highway, CH. And instead of shoving that over the side where they have all those rocks protecting the highway there, all to landfills. That was a tremendous waste. And we should look at every land flood as an opportunity to nourish the shoreline, because that's where that stuff was supposed to end up. It's really ridiculous that we think we can figure out a better way than the way that worked for eons.
Excellent. Thank you for providing that input. It has been very interesting, both as a geologist and someone working on the restoration of landslides here in Malibu. I don't believe I've heard of this idea before, so it's Mother Nature's taking course. Reg, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add to Paul's what he said. An added benefit to sand on the beach is in a changing mean sea level environment, the beach changes with it. And as sea level rises over the years, the backshore beach and the top of the foreshore slope berm raises with it. If it drops, then it drops. That's just nature's way of protecting the beaches. And theoretically, if you had enough sand on the beach, you would, if you had a 4-foot sea level rise, you would see a 4-foot rise in the backshore beach elevation over time. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. It always happens when the sand usually comes back in the summertime. It's placed at a slightly higher elevation. So that also happens. So again, that pushes us into the best thing for Malibu in at least the long term is to make sure that we still have a sand supply and that it's not cut off.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think this is a reoccurring theme, not only in this specific Malibu coastal vulnerability assessment, but in attending a few different climate change conferences and LA County Beaches and Harbors meetings, COC Sea Grants meetings, is the lack of sand in order to help replenish our beaches. So thank you for bringing that up. Are there any other community members that would like to provide input on this question? Okay, I think we'll move on to the next slide. Perfect. So I just want to thank you all for your valuable input. I've furiously been writing down every single answer and word being discussed today. So I wanted to provide you access to our current resources. Here at the link and at our QR code, you'll be able to find our draft coastal vulnerability assessment report, an interactive GIS map. Basically think about Google Earth with overlays of different sea level rise scenarios, and also our survey. So today we've released our public survey asking these very questions that we were discussed today. So if you would prefer to answer in that format, the public survey is open. We're going to keep it open for a month, but you always feel free to contact us at the phone number here or emailing us at Malibu or mbuilding@malibucity.org. With that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for your input, for helping contribute to the Malibu Coastal Vulnerability Assessment Project. And Yeah, for being awesome community members. Thank you so much. Have a good day.